Section 85 of London Labour and the London Poor by Henry Mayhew, Volume 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Peter Yearsley. The Street Folk, Part 85 of the Children Street Sellers of London. When we consider the spirit of emulation, of imitation, of bravado, of opposition, of just or idle resentment among boys, according to their training, companionship, natural disposition, and above all, home treatment, it seems most important to ascertain how these feelings and inclinations are fostered or stimulated by the examples of the free street life of other lads to be seen on every side. There is no doubt that to a large class of boys whose parents are not in poverty, the young street ruffian is a hero. If this inquiry be important, as it unquestionably is, concerning boys, how much more important is it when it includes the female children of the streets, when it relates to the sex who, in all relations of life and in all grades of society, are really the guardians of a people's virtue. The investigation is again rendered more interesting and more important when it includes those children who have known no guidance from parent, master, or relative, but have been flung into the streets through neglect, through viciousness, or as outcasts from utter destitution. Mixed with the children who really sell in the streets are the class who assume to sell that they may have the better chance to steal or the greater facility to beg. Before I classify what I consider to be the causes which have driven children to a street career, with all its hardening consequences, I may point out that culpability cannot be imputed to them at the commencement of their course of life. They have been either untaught, mistaught, maltreated, neglected, regularly trained to vice, or fairly turned into the streets to shift for themselves. The censure, then, is attributable to parents, or those who should fill the place of parents, the state or society. The exceptions to this culpability as regards parents are to be found in the instances where a costermonger employs his children to aid him in his business occupation, which the parents, in their ignorance or prejudices, may account as good as any other, and the youths thus become unfit, perhaps, for any other than a scrambling street life. A second exception may be where the children in a poor family, as continually happens among the Irish in London, must sell in the streets that they may eat in any place. In the following details I shall consider all to be children who are under 15 years of age. It is just beyond that age, or the age of puberty, that, as our prison statistics and other returns show, criminal dispositions are developed, self-will becomes more imperious and headstrong, that destructive propensity or taste which we term the ruling passion or character of the individual is educed, and the destiny of the human being, especially when apart from the moulding and well-directed care of parents or friends, is influenced, perhaps for life. The causes, then, which fill our streets with children who either manifest the keen and sometimes roguish propensity of a precocious trader, the daring and adroitness of the thief, or the loutish indifference of the mere dull vagabond, content if he can only eat and sleep, I consider to be these. 1. The conduct of parents, masters, and mistresses. 2. The companionship and associations formed in tender years. 3. The employment of children by costermongers and others who live by street traffic, and the training of costermongers' children to a street life. 4. Orphanhood, friendlessness, and utter destitution. 5. Vagrant dispositions and tastes on the part of children, which cause them to be runaways. After this I shall treat of A. The pursuits of the street trading children, B. Their earnings, C. The causes or influences which have induced children to adopt some especial branch of a street life, D. Their state of education, E. Their morals, religion, opinions, and conduct, F. Places and character of dwellings, G. Diet, H. Amusements, I. Clothing, J. Propensities. Concerning cause 1, namely the conduct of parents, masters, and mistresses, I should have more to say were I treating of the juvenile criminals instead of sellers in the streets. The brute tyranny of parents, manifested in the wreaking of any annoyances or disappointments they may have endured, in the passionate beating and cursing of their children for trifling or no causes, is among the worst symptoms of a depraved nature. This conduct may be the most common among the poor, for among them are fewer conventional restraints, but it exists among, and debases, other classes. Some parents only exercise this tyranny in their fits of drunkenness, and make that their plea in mitigation, but their dispositions are then only the more undisguisedly developed, and they would be equally unjust or tyrannical when sober, but for some selfish fear which checks them. A boy perhaps endures this course of tyranny some time, and then, finding it increase, he feels its further endurance intolerable, and runs away. If he have no friends with whom he can hope to find a shelter, the streets only are open to him. He soon meets with comrades, some of whom, perhaps, had been circumstanced like himself, and if not strongly disposed to idleness and vicious indulgences, goes through a course of horse-holding, errand-running, parcel-carrying, and such like, and so becomes, if honestly or prudently inclined, a street seller, beginning with fusees or nuts or some unexpensive stock. The where to buy and the how to sell he will find plenty to teach him at the lodging-houses, where he must sleep when he can pay for a bed. When I was collecting information concerning brace selling, I met with a youth of 16 who, about 2 years previously, had run away from Birmingham and made his way to London with 2 shillings and 6pence. Although he earned something weekly, he was so pinched and beaten by a stepmother (his father was seldom at home except on Sunday) that his life was miserable. This went on for nearly a year, until the boy began to resist, and one Saturday evening, when beaten as usual, he struck in return, drawing blood from his stepmother's face. The father came home before the fray was well ended, listened to his wife's statement, and would not listen to the boy's, and in his turn chastised the lad mercilessly. In 5 minutes after, the boy, with aching bones and a bitter spirit, left his father's house and made his way to London, where he was then vending cheap braces. This youth could neither read nor write, and seemed to possess no quickness or intelligence. The only thing of which he cared to talk was his stepmother's treatment of him. All else was a blank with him in comparison. This was the one burning recollection. I may here observe that I heard of several instances of children having run away and adopted a street life in consequence of the violence of stepmothers far more than of stepfathers. I cite the foregoing instance, as the boy's career was exactly that I have described, but the reader will remember that, in the many and curious narratives I have collected, how often the adult street seller has begun such a life by being a runaway from domestic tyranny. Had this Birmingham boy been less honest, or perhaps less dull, it would have been far easier for him to have become a thief than a street trader. To the gangs of young thieves, a new boy who is not known to the police is often, as a smart young pickpocket, then known as the Cock Sparrow, described it to me, a godsend. My readers will remember that in the collected statements of the street folk there are several accounts of runaways, but they were generally older than the age I have fixed, and it was necessary to give an account of one who comes within my classification of a child. I did not hear of any girls who had run away from their homes, having become street sellers merely. They more generally fall into a course of prostitution, or sometimes may be ostensibly street sellers, as a means of accosting men, and, perhaps, for an attractive pretence to the depraved, that they are poor innocent girls struggling for an honest penny. If they resort to the low lodging houses, where the sexes are lodged indiscriminately, their ruin seems inevitable. 2. That the companionship and associations formed in tender years lead many children to a street life is so evident that I may be brief on the subject. There are few who are in the habit of noting what they may observe of poor children in the streets and quieter localities, who have not seen little boys playing at marbles or gambling with halfpennies, farthings, or buttons with other lads, and who have laid down their basket of nuts or oranges to take part in the play. The young street seller has probably more halfpence at his command, or at any rate in his possession, than his non-dealing playmates. He is also in the undoubted possession of what appears a large store of things for which poor boys have generally a craving and a relish. Thus the little itinerant trader is envied and imitated. This attraction to a street career is very strong, I have ascertained, among the neglected children of the poor, when the parents are absent at their work. On a Saturday morning, some little time since, I was in a flagged court near Drury Lane, a wretched place, which was full of children of all ages. The parents were nearly all, I believe, then at work, or on the lookout for a job, as porters in Covent Garden Market, and the children played in the court until their return. In one corner was a group of 4 or 5 little boys gambling and squabbling for nuts, of which one of the number was a vendor. A sharp-looking lad was gazing enviously on, and I asked him to guide me to the room of a man whom I wished to see. He did so, and I gave him a penny. On my leaving the court, I found this boy the most eager of the players, gambling with the penny I had given him. I had occasion to return there a few hours after, and the same lad was leaning against the wall with his hands in his pockets, as if suffering from listlessness. He had had no luck with the nut covey, he told me, but he hoped before long to sell nuts himself. He did not know his age, but he appeared to be about 11. Only last week I saw this same lad hawking a basket very indifferently stocked with oranges. He had raised a shilling, he said, and the early bird, the nickname of a young street seller, had put him up to the way to lay it out. On my asking if his father, a journeyman butcher, knew what he was doing, he replied that so long as he didn't bother his father, he could do what he pleased, and the more he kept out of the father's, way, the better he would be liked and treated. The association of poor boys and girls with the children of the costermongers and of the Irish fruit sellers, who are employed in itinerant vending, is often productive of a strong degree of envy on the part of unemployed little ones, who look upon having the charge of a basket of fruit to be carried in any direction as a species of independence. 3. The employment of children by costermongers and others who live by street traffic, and the training of costermongers' children to a street life, is the ordinary means of increase among the street folk. The children of the costermongers become necessarily, as I have already intimated, street dealers, and, perhaps more innocently than in any other manner, by being required, as soon as their strength enables them, to assist their parents in their work, or sell trifles single-handed for the behoof of their parents. The child does but obey his father, and the father does but rear the child to the calling by which his daily bread is won. This is the case particularly with the Irish, who often have large families, and bring them with them to London. There are, moreover, a great number of boys, anybody's children, as I heard them called, who are tempted and trained to pursue an open-air traffic through being engaged by costermongers or small tradesmen to sell upon commission, or, as it is termed, for bunts. In the curious, and almost in every instance novel, information which I gave to the public concerning the largest body of the street sellers, the costermongers, this word bunts, probably a corruption of bonus, bona being the slang for good, first appeared in print. The mode is this: a certain quantity of saleable, and sometimes of not very saleable, commodities is given to a boy whom a costermonger knows and perhaps employs, and it is arranged that the young commission agent is to get a particular sum for them, which must be paid to the costermonger, I will say 3 shillings, that being somewhere about the maximum. For these articles the lad may ask and obtain any price he can, and whatever he obtains beyond the stipulated 3 shillings is his own profit or bunce. The remuneration thus accruing to the boy vendor of course varies very materially according to the season of the year, the nature of the article, and the neighbourhood in which it is hawked. Much also depends upon whether the boy has a regular market for his commodities, whether he has certain parties to whom he is known and upon whom he can call to solicit custom. If he has, of course his facilities for disposing of his stock in trade are much greater than in the case of one who has only the chance of attracting attention and obtaining custom by mere crying and bawling, "Penny apiece, cauliflowers, 5 bunches a penny, radishes," and such like. The Irish boys call this having a back, an old Hibernian phrase formerly applied to a very different subject and purpose. Another cause of the abundance of street dealers among the boyish fraternity whose parents are unable or unwilling to support them is that some costers keep a lad as a regular assistant, whose duty it is to pull the barrow of his master about the streets and assist him in crying his wares. Sometimes the man and the boy call out together, sometimes separately and alternately, but mostly the boy alone has to do this part of the work, the coster's voice being generally rough and hoarse, while the shrill sound of that of the boy re-echoes throughout the street along which they slowly move, and is far more likely to strike the ear and consequently to attract attention than that of the man. This mode of practising the voice is, however, perfectly ruinous to it, as in almost every case of this description we find the natural tone completely annihilated at a very early age, and a harsh, hoarse, guttural, disagreeable mode of speaking acquired. In addition to the costers, there are others who thus employ boys in the streets. The hawkers of coal do so invariably, and the milkmen, especially those who drive cows or have a cart to carry the milk pails in. Once in the streets, and surrounded with street associates, the boy soon becomes inured to this kind of life, and when he leaves his first master, will frequently start in some branch of costermongering for himself, without seeking to obtain another constant employment. This mode of employing lads, and on the whole perhaps they are fairly enough used by the costermongers, and generally treated with great kindness by the costers' wives or concubines, is, I am inclined to think, the chief cause of the abundance and even increase of the street sellers of fish, fruit, and vegetables. 4. To orphanhood, friendlessness, and utter destitution, the commerce of the streets owes a considerable portion of its merchants. A child finds himself or herself an orphan. The parents having been miserably poor, he or she lives in a place where street folk abound, it seems the only road to a meal and a bed, and the orphan starts with a few lucifer matches, bootlaces, nuts, or onions. It is the same when a child, without being an orphan, is abandoned or neglected by the parents, and, perhaps without any injunctions either for or against such a course, is left to his or her own will to sell or steal in the streets. 5. The vagrant dispositions and tastes of lads, and, it may be, now and then somewhat of a reckless spirit of adventure, which in our days has far fewer fields than it once had, is another cause why a street life is embraced. Lads have been known to run away from even comfortable homes through the mere spirit of restlessness, and sometimes they have done so, but not perhaps under the age of 15, for the unrestrained indulgence of licentious passions. As this class of runaways, however, do not ordinarily settle into regular street sellers, but become pickpockets, or trade only with a view to cloak their designs of theft, I need not further allude to them under this head. I now come to the second part of my subject, the pursuits, and so on, of the children in street avocations. As I have shown in my account of the women street sellers, there is no calling which this body of juveniles monopolise, none of which they are the sole possessors, but some are principally in their hands, and there are others again to which they rarely incline. Among the wares sold by the boys and girls of the streets are money bags, lucifer matchboxes, leather straps, belts, firewood, common and also patent, that is, dipped into an inflammable composition, fly papers, a variety of fruits, especially nuts, oranges and apples, onions, radishes, watercresses, cut flowers and lavender, mostly sold by girls, sweetbriar, india rubber, garters, and other little articles of the same material, including elastic rings to encircle rolls of paper music, toys of the smaller kinds, cakes, steel pens and pen holders with glass handles, exhibition medals and cards, gelatin cards, glass and other cheap seals, brass watch guards, chains and rings, small tinware, nutmeg graters, and other articles of a similar description, such as are easily portable, iron skewers, fusees, shirt buttons, boot and stay laces, pins, and more rarely needles, cotton bobbins, Christmasing, holly and other evergreens at Christmastide, May flowers, coat studs, toy pottery, blackberries, groundsel and chickweed, and clothes pegs. There are also other things which children sell temporarily, or rather in the season. This year I saw lads selling wild birds' nests with their eggs, such as hedge sparrows, minnows in small glass globes, roots of the wild early orchis, Orchis mascula, and such like things found only out of town. Independently of the vending of these articles, there are many other ways of earning a penny among the street boys. Among them are found tumblers, mudlarks, waterjacks, Ethiopians, ballad singers, bagpipe boys, the variety of street musicians, especially Italian boys with organs, Billingsgate boys or young roughs, Covent Garden boys, porters and shoeblacks, a class recently increased by the Ragged School Brigade. A great many lads are employed also in giving away the cards and placards of advertising and puffing tradesmen, and around the theatres are children of both sexes, along with a few old people, offering playbills for sale, but this is an occupation less pursued than formerly, as some managers sell their own bills inside the house, and do not allow any to pass from the hands of the printer into those of the former vendors. Again, amid the employment of this class may be mentioned the going on errands and carrying parcels for persons accidentally met with, holding horses, sweeping crossings, but the best crossings are usually in the possession of adults, carrying trunks for any railway traveller to or from the terminus, and carrying them from an omnibus when the passenger is not put down at his exact destination. During the frosty days of the winter and early spring, some of these little fellows used to run along the footpath — Baker Street was a favourite place for this display — and keep pace with the omnibuses, not merely by using their legs briskly, but by throwing themselves every now and then on their hands and progressing a few steps, so to speak, with their feet in the air. This was done to attract attention and obtain the preference, if a job were in prospect. Done, too, in hopes of a halfpenny being given the urchin for his agility. I looked at the hands of one of these little fellows, and the fleshy parts of the palm were as hard as soling leather, as hard indeed as the soles of the child's feet, for he was barefooted. At the doors of the theatres, and of public places generally, boys are always in waiting to secure a cab from the stand, their best harvest being when the night has turned out wet after a fine day. Boys wait for the same purpose, lounging all night, and until the place closes, about the night houses, casinos, saloons, and so on, and sometimes without receiving a penny. There are again the very many ways in which street boys employed to help other people when temporary help is needed, as when a cabman must finish the cleaning of his vehicle in a hurry, or when a porter finds himself overweighted in his truck. Boys are, moreover, the common custodians of the donkeys on which young ladies take invigorating exercise in such places as Hampstead Heath and Blackheath. At pigeon-shooting matches they are in readiness to pick up the dead birds, and secure the poor fluttering things which are hard hit by the adventurous sportsman without having been killed. They have their share again in the picking of currants and gooseberries, the pottling of strawberries, in weeding, and so on and so on. And though the younger children may be little employed in haymaking or in the more important labours of the corn harvest, they have their shares, both with and without the company of their parents, in the hopping. In fine, there is no business carried on to any extent in the streets or in the open air, but it will be found that boys have their portion. Thus they are brought into contact with all classes, another proof of what I have advanced touching the importance of this subject. It will be perceived that under this head I have had to speak far more frequently of boys than of girls, for the boy is far more the child of the streets than is the girl. The female child can do little but sell, when a livelihood is to be gained without a recourse to immorality. The boy can not only sell, but work. The many ramifications of child life and of child work in our teeming streets, which I have just enumerated, render it difficult to arrive at a very nice estimation of the earnings of the street boys and girls. The gains of this week are not necessarily the gains of the next. There is the influence of the weather. There may be a larger or a smaller number of hands taking a turn at any particular calling this week than in its predecessor. And above all, there is that concatenation of circumstances which street sellers include in one expressive word, luck. I mean the opportunities to earn a few pence which on some occasions present themselves freely, and at others do not occur at all. Such luck, however, is more felt by the holders of horses, and the class of waiters upon opportunity, so to speak, than by those who depend upon trade. I believe, however, both in consequence of what I have observed and from the concurrent testimony of persons familiar with the child life of London streets, that the earnings of the children, when they are healthful and active, are about the same in the several capacities they exercise. The waiter on opportunity, the lad on the look-out for a job, may wait and look out all day bootlessly, but in the evening some fortunate chance may realise him a whole tanner all in a lump. In like manner, the watercress girl may drudge on from early morning until cresses are wanted for tea, and with a connection and a tolerably regular demand, earn no more than the boy's sixpence, and probably not so much. One of the most profitable callings of the street child is in the sale of Christmasings, but that is only for a very brief season. The most regular returns in the child's trade are in the sale of such things as watercresses, or any low-priced article of daily consumption, wherever the youthful vendor may be known. I find it necessary to place the earnings of the street children higher than those of the aged and infirm. The children are more active, more persevering, and perhaps more impudent. They are less deterred by the weather, and can endure more fatigue in walking long distances than old people. This, however, relates to the boys more especially, some of whom are very sturdy fellows. The oranges which the street children now vend at 2 a penny leave them a profit of 4p. in the shilling. To take 1 shilling and 6p. with a profit of 6p. is a fair day's work. To take 1 shilling with a profit of 4p. is a poor day's work. The dozen bunches of cut flowers which a girl will sell on an average day at 1 penny a bunch cost her 6p., that sum being also her profit. These things supply, I think, a fair criterion. The children's profits may be 6p. a day, and, including Sunday trade, 3 shillings and 6p. a week, but with the drawbacks of bad weather they cannot be computed at more than 2 shillings and 6p. a week the year through. The boys may earn 2p. or 3p. a week, on an average, more than the girls, except in such things which I shall specify under the next head, as seem more particularly suited for female traffic. Of the causes which influence children to follow this or that course of business, when a street career has been their choice or their lot, I have little to say. It seems quite a matter of chance, even where a preference may exist. A runaway lad meets with a comrade who perhaps sells fusees, and he accordingly begins on fusees. One youth of whom I have given an account, but he was not of child's estate, began his street career on fly-papers. When children are sent into the streets to sell on account of their parents, they, of course, vend just what their parents have supplied to them. If on their own hook, they usually commence their street career on what it is easiest to buy and easiest to sell. A few nuts or oranges, bought in Duke's Place, lucifer boxes or small wares. As their experience increases, they may become general street sellers. The duller sort will continue to carry on the trades that anyone with ordinary lungs and muscle can pursue. "All a fellow wants to know to sell potatoes," said a master street seller to me, "is to tell how many tanners make a bob and how many yennaps a tanner." Note, how many sixpences make a shilling and how many pence a sixpence. End note. The smarter and bolder lads ripen into patterers or street performers, or fall into theft. For the class of adventurous runaways, the patterers, or rather the paper-working patterer's life, with its alternations of town and country, fairs and hangings, the bustle of race grounds and the stillness of a village, has great attractions. To a pattering and chaunting career, moreover, there is the stimulus of that love of approbation and of admiration, as strong among the often penniless professionals of the streets as on the boards of the opera house. Perhaps there is not a child of either sex, now a street seller, who would not to-morrow, if they thought they could clear a penny or two a day more by it, quit their baskets of oranges and sell candle ends or old bones or anything. In a street career, and most especially when united with a lodging-house existence, there is no daintiness of the senses and no exercise of the tastes. The question is not, what do I like best to sell, but what is likely to pay me best. This cannot be wondered at, for if a child earn but 5d. a day on apples, and can make 6d. on onions, its income is increased by 20%. The trades which I have specified as in the hands of street children are carried on by both sexes. I do not know that even the stock in trade which most taxes the strength is more a boy's than a girl's pursuit. A basket of oranges or of apples is among the heaviest of all the stocks hawked by children, and in those pursuits there are certainly as many, or rather more, girls than boys. Such articles as fly-papers, money-bags, tins, fusees, and Christmasing are chiefly the boys' sale. Cut flowers, lavender, watercresses, and small wares are more within the trading of the girls. The callings with which children do not meddle are those which require patter. Some of the boys very glibly announce their wares, and may be profuse now and then in commendations of their quality, cheapness, and superiority, but it requires a longer experience to patter according to the appreciation of a perhaps critical street audience. No child, for instance, ventures upon the sale of grease-removing compositions, corn salve, or the trial and execution of Thomas Drury, with an affecting copy of verses. A gentleman remarked to me that it was rather curious that boys' playthings, such as marbles and tops, were not hawked by street juveniles, who might be very well able to recommend them. I do not remember to have seen any such things vended by children. End of section 85. Section 86 of London Labour and the London Poor by Henry Mayhew, Volume 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Peter Yearsley. The Street Folk, Part 86. Education is, as far as I have been able to ascertain, more widely extended among street children than it was 12 or 15 years ago. The difficulty in arriving at any conclusion on such a subject is owing to the inability to find anyone who knew, or could even form a tolerably accurate judgment of what was the state of education among these juveniles even 12 years back. Perhaps it may be sufficiently correct to say that among a given number of street children, where a dozen years ago you met 20 who could read, you will now meet upwards of 30. Of 16 children, none apparently 15 years of age, whom I questioned on the subject, 9 admitted that they could not read, the other 7 declared that they could, but 3 annexed to the avowal the qualifying words, "a little." 10 were boys and 6 were girls, and I spoke to them promiscuously as I met them in the street. 2 were Irish lads who were working oranges in company, and the bigger answered, "Sure then, we can read, your honour, sir." I have little doubt that they could, but in all probability, had either of those urchins thought he would be a penny the better by it, he would have professed to a perfect stranger that he had a knowledge of algebra. "Yes, sir, I do then," would very likely be his response to any such inquiry, and when told he could not possibly know anything about it, he would answer, then, but I didn't understand, your honour." To the ragged schools is, in all probability, owing this extension of the ability to read. It appears that the attendance of the street children at the ragged school is most uncertain, as indeed must necessarily be the case where the whole time of the lad is devoted to obtaining a subsistence. From the best information I can collect, it appears that the average attendance of these boys at these schools does not exceed 2 hours per week, so that the amount of education thus acquired, if education it may be called, must necessarily be scanty in the extreme, and is frequently forgotten as soon as learned. With many of these little traders, a natural shrewdness compensates in some measure for the deficiency of education, and enables them to carry on their variety of trades with readiness and dexterity, and sometimes with exactness. One boy with whom I had a conversation told me that he never made any mistake about the coppers, although, as I subsequently discovered, he had no notion at all of arithmetic, beyond the capability of counting how many pieces of coin he had, and how much copper money was required to make a tanner or a bob. This boy vended coat studs. He had also some metal collars for dogs, or, as he said, for cats either. These articles he purchased at the same shop in Houndsditch, where there was a wonderful lot of other things to be had, only some of 'em cost more money. In speaking of money, the slang phrases are constantly used by the street lads. Thus, a sixpence is a tanner, a shilling a bob or a hog, a crown is a bull, a half-crown a half-bull, and so on. Little, as a modern writer has remarked, do the persons using these phrases know of their remote and somewhat classical origin, which may indeed be traced to the period antecedent to that when monarchs monopolized the surface of coined money with their own images and superscriptions. They are identical with the very name of money among the early Romans, which was pecunia, from pecus, a flock. The collections of coin dealers amply show that the figure of a hog was anciently placed on a small silver coin, and that of a bull decorated larger ones of the same metal. These coins were frequently deeply crossed on the reverse. This was for the convenience of easily breaking them into 2 or more pieces, should the bargain for which they were employed require it, and the parties making it had no smaller change handy to complete the transaction. Thus we find that the half-bull of the itinerant street seller or traveller, so far from being a phrase of modern invention, as is generally supposed, is in point of fact referable to an era extremely remote. Numerous other instances might be given of the classical origin of many of the flash or slang words used by these people. I now give the answers I received from 2 boys. The first, his mother told me, was the best scholar at his school when he was there, and before he had to help her in street sale. He was a pale and not at all forward boy of 13 or 14, and did not appear much to admire being questioned. He had not been to a ragged school, but to an academy kept by an old man. He did not know what the weekly charge was, but when father was living, he died last autumn, the schoolmaster used to take it out in vegetables. Father was a costermonger. Mother minded all about his schooling, and master often said she behaved to him like a lady. God, this child told me, was our heavenly Father, and the maker of all things. He knew everything and everybody. He knew people's thoughts and every sin they committed, if no one else knew it. He was the kingdom and the power and the glory, for ever and ever. Amen. Jesus Christ was our Lord and Saviour. He was the Son of God, and was crucified for our sins. He was a God himself. Note: the child understood next to nothing of the doctrine of the Trinity, and I did not press him. End note. The Scriptures, which were the Bible and Testament, were the Word of God, and contained nothing but what was good and true. If a boy lied, or stole, or committed sins, he said, he would be punished in the next world, which endured for ever and ever. Amen. It was only after death, when it was too late to repent, that people went to the next world. He attended chapel sometimes. As to mundane matters, the boy told me that Victoria was Queen of Great Britain and Ireland. She was born May the 24th, 1819, and succeeded his late Majesty King William IV, July the 20th, 1837. She was married to His Royal Highness Prince Albert, and so on and so on. France was a different country to this. He had heard there was no king or queen there, but didn't understand about it. You couldn't go to France by land, no more than you could to Ireland. Didn't know anything of the old times in history, hadn't been told. Had heard of the Battle of Waterloo, the English licked. Had heard of the Battle of Trafalgar, and of Lord Nelson. Didn't know much about him, but there was his pillar at Charing Cross, just by the candlesticks. Note: fountains. End note. When I spoke of astronomy, the boy at once told me he knew nothing about it. He had heard that the earth went round the sun, but from what he'd noticed, shouldn't have thought it. He didn't think that the sun went round the earth, it seemed to go more sideways. Would like to read more if he had time, but he had a few books, and there was hundreds not so well off as he was. I am far from undervaluing, indeed I would not indulge in an approach to a scoff at the extent of this boy's knowledge. Many a man who piques himself on the plenitude of his breeches pocket, and who attributes his success in life to the fullness of his knowledge, knows no more of nature, man, and God than this poor street child. Another boy, perhaps a few months older, gave me his notions of men and things. He was a thick-limbed, red-cheeked fellow, answered very freely, and sometimes, when I could not help laughing at his replies, laughed loudly himself, as if he entered into the joke. Yes, he had heard of God who made the world. Couldn't exactly recollect when he'd heard on him, but he had, most certainly. Didn't know when the world was made, or how anybody could do it. It must have taken a long time. It was afore his time, or yourn either, sir. Knew there was a book called the Bible. Didn't know what it was about, didn't mind to know. Knew of such a book to a sartainty, because a young woman took one to pop, note, pawn, end note, for an old woman that was on the spree, a brand new un. But the cove wouldn't have it, and the old woman said he might be D. Never heerd tell on the deluge, of the world having been drownded. It couldn't, for there wasn't water enough to do it. He weren't a-going to fret hisself for such things as that. Didn't know what happened to people after death, only that they was buried. Had seen a dead body laid out. Was a little afeared at first. Poor Dick looked so different, and when you touched his face he was so cold. Oh, so cold. Had heerd on another world. Wouldn't mind if he was there hisself. if he could do better, for things was often queer here. Had heerd on it from a tailor, such a clever cove, a stunner, as went to Australia, Australia, and heerd him say he was going into another world. Had never heerd of France, but had heerd of Frenchmen. There wasn't half a quarter so many on 'em as of Italians, with their earrings like flash galbs. Didn't dislike foreigners, for he never saw none. What was they? Had heerd of Ireland, didn't know where it was, but it couldn't be very far, or such lots wouldn't come from there to London. Should say they walked it, aye, every bit of the way, for he'd seen them come in all covered with dust. Had heerd of people going to sea, and had seen the ships in the river, but didn't know nothing about it, for he was very seldom that way. The sun was made of fire, or it wouldn't make you feel so warm. The stars was fire too, or they wouldn't shine. They didn't make it warm, they was too small. Didn't know any use they was of. Didn't know how far they was off. A jolly lot higher than the gas lights, some on 'em was. Was never in a church. Had heerd they worshipped God there. Didn't know how it was done. Had heerd singing and playing inside when he'd passed. Never was there, for he hadn't no togs to go in, and wouldn't be let in among such swells as he had seen coming out. Was a ignorant chap, for he'd never been to school, but was up to many a move, and didn't do bad. Mother said he would make his fortune yet. Had heerd of the Duke of Wellington. He was old nosy. Didn't think he ever seed him, but had seed his statty. Hadn't heerd of the Battle of Waterloo, nor who it was atween. Once lived in Weber Row, Waterloo Road. Thought he had heerd speak of Bonaparte. Didn't know what he was. Thought he had heerd of Shakespeare, but didn't know whether he was alive or dead, and didn't care. A man with something like that name kept a dolly and did stunning, but he was such a hard cove that if he was dead it wouldn't matter. Had seen the Queen, but didn't recollect her name just at the minute. Oh yes, Victoria and Albert. Had no notion what the Queen had to do. Should think she hadn't such power. He had first to ask me what power was, as the Lord Mayor, or as Mr. Norton, as was the Lambeth Beak, and perhaps is still. Was never once before a beak, and didn't want to. Hated the crushers. What business had they to interfere with him if he was only resting his basket in a street? Had been once to the Wick, and once to the Bower. Liked tumbling better. He meant to have a little pleasure when the peas came in. The knowledge and the ignorance of these two striplings represent that of street children generally. Those who may have run away from a good school, or a better sort of home, as far as means constitute such betterness, of course form exceptions. So do the utterly stupid. The morals, religion, and opinions of the street trading children are the next topic. Their business morals have been indicated in the course of my former statements, and in the general tone of the remarks and conversation of street sellers. As traders, their morals may be lax enough. They give short weight, and they give short measure. They prick the juice out of oranges, and brush up old figs to declare they're new. Their silk braces are cotton, their buck-leather braces are wash-leather, their sponge is often rotten, and their salves and cures quackeries. Speak to any one of the quicker-witted street sellers on the subject, and though he may be unable to deny that his brother traders are guilty of these shortcomings, he will justify them all by the example of shopkeepers. One man especially, with whom I have more than once conversed on the subject, broadly asserts that, as a whole, the streets are, in all matters of business, honester than the shops. "It ain't we," runs the purport of his remarks, "as makes coffee out of sham chicory. It ain't we as makes cigars out of rhubarb leaves. We don't make duffers' handkerchiefs, nor weave cotton things and call them silk. If we quacks a bit, does we make fortunes by it, as shopkeepers does with their ointments and pills? If we give slang weights, how many rich shopkeepers is fined for that there, and how many's never found out? And when one on 'em's fined, why, he calculates how much he's into pocket, between what he's made by slanging and what he's been fined, and on he goes again. He didn't know that there ever was short weight given in his shop, not he, no more do we at our stalls or barrows. Who adulterates the beer? Who makes old tea leaves into new? who grinds rice among pepper. And as for smuggling, but nobody thinks there's any harm in buying smuggled things. What we does is like that pencil you're writing with to a great tree compared to what the rich people does. Oh, don't tell me, sir. A gentleman like you that sees so much of what's going on must know we're better than the shopkeepers are. To remarks such as these I have nothing to answer. It would be idle to point out to such casuists that the commission of one wrong can never justify another. The ignorant reverse the doctrine of right, and live not by rule but by example. I have unsparingly exposed the rogueries and trickeries of the street people, and it is but fair that one of them should be heard in explanation, if not in justification. The trade ethics of the adult street folk are also that of the juveniles, so on this subject I need dwell no longer. What I have said of the religion of the women street sellers applies with equal truth to the children. Their religious feelings are generally formed for them by their parents, especially their mothers. If the children have no such direction, then they have no religion. I did not question the street seller before quoted on this subject of the want of the Christian spirit among his fraternity, old or young, or he would at once have asked me, in substance, to tell him in what class of society the real Christian spirit was to be found. As to the opinions of the street children, I can say little. For the most part, they have formed no opinions of anything beyond what affects their daily struggles for bread. Of politics, such children can know nothing. If they are anything, they are Chartists in feeling, and are in general honest haters of the police and of most constituted authorities, whom they often confound with the police officer. As to their opinions of the claims of friendship, and of the duty of assisting one another, I believe these children feel and understand nothing about such matters. The hard struggles of their lives, and the little sympathy they meet with, make them selfish. There may be companionship among them, but no friendship, and this applies, I think, alike to boys and girls. The boy's opinion of the girl seems to be that she is made to help him, or to supply gratification to his passions. There is yet a difficult inquiry as to the opinions which are formed by the young females reared to a street life. I fear that those opinions are not, and cannot be powerfully swayed in favour of, chastity, especially if the street girl have the quickness to perceive that marriage is not much honoured among the most numerous body of street folk. If she have not the quickness to understand this, then her ignorance is in itself most dangerous to her virtue. She may hear, too, expressions of an opinion that going to church to be wed is only to put money into the clergyman's, or, as these people say, the parson's, pocket. Without the watchful care of the mother, the poor girl may form an illicit connection, with little or no knowledge that she is doing wrong, and perhaps a kind and indulgent mother may be herself but a concubine, feeling little respect for a ceremony she did not scruple to dispense with. To such opinions, however, the Irish furnish the exception. The dwelling places of the street children are in the same localities as I specified regarding the women. Those who reside with their parents or employers sleep usually in the same room with them, and sometimes in the same bed. Nearly the whole of those, however, who support themselves by street trade live, or rather sleep, in the lodging-houses. It is the same with those who live by street vagrancy or begging, or by street theft, and for this lazy or dishonest class of children, the worst description of lodging-houses have the strongest attractions, as they meet continually with tramps from the country, and keep up a constant current of scheming and excitement. It seems somewhat curious that, considering the filth and noisomeness of some of these lodging-houses, the children who are inmates suffer only the average extent of sickness and mortality common to the districts crammed with the poor. Perhaps it may be accounted for by the circumstance of their being early risers, and their being in the open air all day, so that they are fatigued at the close of day, and their sleep is deep and unbroken. I was assured by a well-educated man, who was compelled to resort to such places, that he has seen children sleep most profoundly in a lodging-house throughout a loud and long-continued disturbance. Many street children who are either alone in the world, or afraid to return home after a bad day's sail, sleep in the markets or under the dry arches. There are many other lads who, being unable to pay the penny, twopence, or threepence demanded in prepayment by the lodging-house keepers, pass the night in the streets, wherever shelter may be attainable. The number of outcast boys and girls who sleep in and about the purlieus of Covent Garden Market each night, especially during the summer months, has been computed variously, and no doubt differs according to circumstances. But those with whom I have spoken upon the subject, and who of all others are most likely to know, consider the average to be upwards of 200. End of section 86. Section 87 of London Labour and the London Poor by Henry Mayhew, Volume 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, recording by Peter Yearsley. The Street Folk, Part 87. The diet of the street children is, in some cases, an alternation of surfeit and inanition, more especially that of the stripling, who is on his own hook. If money be unexpectedly attained, a boy will gorge himself with such dainties as he loves. If he earn no money, he will fast all day patiently enough, perhaps drinking profusely of water. A cake seller told me that, a little while before I saw him, a lad of 12 or so had consumed a shilling's worth of cakes and pastry, as he had got a shilling by fiddling, not, it be understood, by the exercise of any musical skill, for fiddling among the initiated means the holding of horses or the performing of any odd jobs. Of these cakes and pastry, the cakes being from 2 to 12 a penny, and the pastry, tarts, and coventries, three-cornered tarts, 2 a penny, the street urchins are very fond. To me, they seemed to possess no recommendation either to the nose or the palate. The strong flavour of these preparations is, in all probability, as grateful to the palate of an itinerant youth as is the high gout of the grouse or the woodcock to the fashionable epicure. In this respect, as in others which I have pointed out, the extremes of society meet. These remarks apply far more to the male than to the female children. Some of the street boys will walk a considerable distance, when they are in funds, to buy pastry of the Jew boys in the Minories, Houndsditch, and Whitechapel, those keen traders being reputed, and no doubt with truth, to supply the best cakes and pastry of any. A more staple article of diet, which yet partakes of the character of a dainty, is in great demand by the class I treat of, pudding. A halfpenny or a pennyworth of baked plum, boiled plum, or plum duff, currant, or plum batter pudding studded with raisins, is often a dinner. This pudding is almost always bought in the shops. Indeed, in a street apparatus there could hardly be the necessary heat diffused over the surface required. And, as I have told of a distance being travelled to buy pastry of the Jew boys, so is it traversed to buy pudding at the best shops. The proprietor of one of those shops, upon whom I called to make inquiries, told me that he sold about 300 pennyworths of pudding in a day. 2/3 of this quantity he sold to juveniles under 15 years of age, but he hadn't noticed particularly, and so could only guess. This man, when he understood the object of my inquiry, insisted upon my tasting his batter, which really was very good, and tasted, I do not know how otherwise to describe it, honest. His profits were not large, he said, and judging from the size and quality of his oblong halfpenny and pennyworths of batter pudding, I have no doubt he stated the fact. "There's many a poor man and woman," he said, "ay, sir, and some that you would think from their appearance might go to an eating-house to dine, make a meal off my pudding, as well as the street little ones. The boys are often tiresome. "Master," they'll say, "can't you give us a plummier bit than this?" Or, "Is it just up? I likes it hot, all hot." The baked tater from the street dealer's can, more frequently than from the shops, is another enjoyable portion of the street child's diet. Of the sale to the juvenile population of pickled whelks, stewed eels, oysters, boiled meat puddings, and other articles of street traffic, I have spoken under their respective heads. The Irish children who live with their parents fare as the parents fare. If very poor, or if bent upon saving for some purpose, their diet is tea and butter, or bread without butter. If not so very poor, still tea and so on, but sometimes with a little fish, and sometimes with a piece of meat on Sundays. But the Sunday's meat is more common among the poor English than the poor Irish street traders. Indeed, the English street traders generally live better than the Irish. The coster boys often fare well and abundantly. The children living in the lodging houses, I am informed, generally partake only of such meals as they can procure abroad. Sometimes of a night they may partake of the cheap beef or mutton purveyed by some inmate who has been lifting flesh (stealing meat), or sawney (bacon). Vegetables, excepting the baked potato, they rarely taste. Of animal food, perhaps, they partake more of bacon, and relish it the most. Drinking is not, from what I can learn, common among the street boys. The thieves are generally sober fellows, and of the others, when they are in luck, a half pint of beer to relish the bread and saveloy of the dinner, and a pennyworth of gin to keep the cold out, are often the extent of the potations. The exceptions are among the ignorant coster lads, who, when they have been prosperous in their bunts, drink and ape the vices of men. The girls, I am told, are generally fonder of gin than the boys. Elder wine and ginger beer are less popular among children than they used to be. Many of the lads smoke. The amusements of the street children are such as I have described in my account of the costermongers, but in a moderate degree, as those who partake with the greatest zest of such amusements as the penny gaff (penny theatre) and the twopenny hop dance are more advanced in years. Many of the penny gaffs, however, since I last wrote on the subject, have been suppressed, and the twopenny hops are not half so frequent as they were 5 or 6 years back. The Jew boys of the streets play at draughts or dominoes in coffee houses which they frequent. In one, in the London Road, at which I had occasion to call, were 8 of these urchins thus occupied, and they play for money or its equivalent. But these sedentary games obtain little among the other and more restless street lads. I believe that not one half of them know the cards, but they are fond of gambling at pitch and toss for halfpennies or farthings. The clothing of the street children, however it may vary in texture, fashion, and colour, has one pervading characteristic: it is never made for the wearers. The exceptions to this rule seem to be those where a child has run away and retains, through good fortune or natural acuteness, the superior attire he wore before he made the choice, if choice he had, of a street life, and where the pride of a mother whose costermonger husband is getting on clothes little Jack or Bill in a new Sunday suit. Even then the suit is more likely to be bought ready-made than made to measure, nor is it worn in business hours until the gloss of novelty has departed. The boys and girls wear every variety of clothing. It is often begged, but if bought, it is bought from the fusty stocks of old clothes in Petticoat and Rosemary lanes. These rags are worn by the children as long as they will hold or can be tied or pinned together, and when they drop off from continued wear, from dirt, and from the ravages of vermin, the child sets his wits to work to procure more. One mode of obtaining a fresh supply is far less available than it was 3 or 4 years back. This was for the lads to denude themselves of their rags, and tearing them up in the casual ward of a workhouse, as it were compel the parish officers to provide them with fresh apparel. This mode may be successful in parts of the country still, but it is not so, or to a very limited extent, in town. The largest, and what was accounted by the vagrants the most liberal, of all the casual wards of the metropolitan workhouses, that of Marylebone, has been closed above 2 years. So numerous were the applicants for admission, and so popular among the vagrants was Marylebone Workhouse, that a fever resulted and attacked that large establishment. It was not uncommon for the Irish who trudged up from Liverpool to be advised by some London vagrant whom they met to go at once, when they reached the capital, to Marylebone Workhouse, and that the Irishman might not forget a name that was new to him, his friendly adviser would write it down for him, and a troop of poor wretched Irish children, with parents as wretched, would go to Marylebone Workhouse, and in their ignorance or simplicity present the address which had been given to them, as if it were a regular order for admission. Boys have sometimes committed offences that they might get into prison, and as they contrived that their apparel should be unfit for purposes of decency, or perhaps their rags had become unfit to wear, they could not be sent naked into the streets again, and so had clothing given to them. A shirt will be worn by one of those wretched urchins without washing until it falls asunder, and many have no shirts. The girls are on the whole less ragged than the boys. The most disgusting parts of their persons or apparel, I speak here more of the vagrant or the mixed vagrant trading and selling girl, often a child prostitute, than of the regular street seller. The worst particular of these girls' appearance, I repeat, is in their foul and matted hair, which looks as if it would defy sponge, comb, and brush to purify it, and in the broken and filthy boots and stockings, which they never seem to button or to garter. The propensities of the street children are the last division of my inquiry, and an ample field is presented, alike for wonder, disgust, pity, hope, and regret. Perhaps the most remarkable characteristic of these wretched children is their extraordinary licentiousness. Nothing can well exceed the extreme animal fondness for the opposite sex which prevails amongst them. Some rather singular circumstances connected with this subject have come to my knowledge, and from these facts it would appear that the age of puberty, or something closely resembling it, may be attained at a much less numerical amount of years than that at which most writers upon the human species have hitherto fixed it. Probably such circumstances as the promiscuous sleeping together of both sexes, the example of the older persons indulging in the grossest immorality in the presence of the young, and the use of obscene expressions, may tend to produce or force an unnatural precocity, a precocity sure to undermine health and shorten life. Jealousy is another characteristic of these children, and perhaps less among the girls than the boys. Upon the most trivial offence in this respect, or on the suspicion of an offence, the gals are sure to be beaten cruelly and savagely by their chaps. This appears to be a very common case. The details of filthiness and of all uncleanness which I gave in a recent number as things of course in certain lodging-houses render it unnecessary to dwell longer upon the subject, and it is one from which I willingly turn to other matters. In addition to the licentious, the vagabond propensities of this class are very striking. As soon as the warm weather commences, boys and girls, but more especially boys, leave the town in shoals, traversing the country in every direction, some furnished with trifling articles, such as I have already enumerated, to sell, and others to begging, lurking, or thieving. It is not the street sellers who so much resort to the tramp, as those who are devoid of the commonest notions of honesty, a quality these young vagrants sometimes respect when in fear of a jail, and the hard work with which such a place is identified in their minds, and to which, with the peculiar idiosyncrasy of a roving race, they have an insuperable objection. I have met with boys and girls, however, to whom a jail had no terrors, and to whom, when in prison, there was only one dread, and that a common one among the ignorant, whether with or without any sense of religion, superstition. "I lay in prison of a night, sir," said a boy who was generally among the briskest of his class, "and think I shall see things." The things represent the vague fears which many, not naturally stupid, but untaught or ill-taught persons entertain in the dark. A girl, a perfect termagant in the breaking of windows and such like offences, told me something of the same kind. She spoke well of the treatment she experienced in prison, and seemed to have a liking for the matron and officials. Her conduct there was quiet and respectful. I believe she was not addicted to drink. Many of the girls, as well as the boys, of course, trade as they tramp. They often sell, both in the country and in town, little necklaces composed of red berries strung together upon thick thread, for dolls and children, and although I have asked several of them, I have never yet found one who collected the berries and made the necklaces themselves. Neither have I met with a single instance in which the girl vendors knew the name of the berries thus used, nor, indeed, even that they were berries. The invariable reply to my questions upon this point has been that they are called necklaces, that they are just as they sell them to us, that they don't know whether they are made or whether they grow, and, in most cases, that they gets them in London by Shoreditch, although in one case a little brown-complexioned girl, with bright sparkling eyes, said that she got them from the gipsies. At first I fancied from this child's appearance that she was rather superior in intellect to most of her class, but I soon found that she was not a whit above the others, unless, indeed, it were in the possession of the quality of cunning. Some of the boys on their country excursions trade in dominoes. They carry a variety of boxes, each differing in size and varying accordingly in price. The lowest priced boxes are mostly sixpence each, sometimes fourpence or even threepence, the highest 1 shilling. An informant told me that these boxes are charged to him at the rate of 20 to 25% less, but if, as is commonly the case, he could take a number at a time, he would have them at a smaller price still. They are very rudely made and soon fall to pieces, unless handled with extreme care. Most of the boys who vend this article play at the game themselves, and some with skill, but in every case, I believe, there is a willingness to cheat, or take advantage, which is hardly disguised. One boy told me candidly that those who make the most money are considered to be the cleverest, whether by selling or cheating, or both, at the game. Nor can it be said that this estimation of cleverness is peculiar to these children. At this season of the year, great numbers of the street children attend the races in different parts of the country, more especially at those in the vicinity of a large town. The racecourse of Wolverhampton, for instance, is usually thronged with them during the period of the sport. While taking these peregrinations, they sometimes sleep in the low lodging-houses with which most of our provincial towns abound, frequently skipper it in the open air, when the weather is fine and warm, and occasionally in barns or outhouses attached to farms and cottages. Sometimes they travel in couples, a boy and a girl, or 2 boys, or 2 girls, but the latter is not so common a case as either of the former. It is rare that more than two may be met in company with each other, except indeed of a night, and then they usually herd together in numbers. The boys who carry dominoes sometimes also have a sheet of paper for sale, on which is rudely printed a representation of a draught board and men, the latter of which are of two colours, black and white, and may be cut out with a pair of scissors, thus forming a ready means of playing a game so popular in rustic places. These sheets of paper are sold, if no more can be got for them, at a penny each. The boy who showed them to me said he gave a halfpenny apiece for them, or sixpence for 15. He said he always bought them in London, and that he did not know any other place to get them at, nor had ever heard of any talk of their being bought nowhere else. The extraordinary lasciviousness of this class, which I have already mentioned, appears to continue to mark their character during their vagabondizing career in the country as fully as in town. Indeed, an informant, upon whom I think I may rely, says that the nightly scenes of youthful or even childish profligacy in the low lodging-houses of the small provincial towns quite equal, even if they do not exceed, those which may be witnessed in the metropolis itself. Towards the approach of winter, these children, like the vagrants of an older growth, advance towards London. Some remain in the larger towns, such as Liverpool, Manchester, Birmingham, Sheffield, and so on, but the greater proportion appear to return to the metropolis, where they resume the life they had previously led, anything but improved in education, morals, manners, or social position generally, by their summer's excursion. The language spoken by this rambling class is peculiar in its construction. It consists of an odd medley of cockneyfied English, rude provincialisms, and a large proportion of the slang commonly used by gipsies and other travellers in conveying their ideas to those whom they wish to purchase their commodities. Among the propensities of the street boys, I do not think that pugnacity, or a fondness, or even a great readiness for fighting is a predominant element. Gambling and thieving may be rife among a class of these poor wretches, and it may not unfrequently happen that force is resorted to by one boy bigger than another to obtain the halfpence of which the smaller child is known to be possessed. Thus quarrels among them are very frequent, but they rarely lead to fighting. Even in the full swing and fury of their jealousy, it does not appear that these boys attack the object of their suspicions, but prefer the less hazardous course of chastising the delinquent or unjustly suspected girl. The girls in the low lodging-houses, I was told a little time since, by a woman who used to frequent them, sometimes, not often, scratched one another until the two had bloody faces, and they tried to bite one another now and then, but they seldom fought. What was this poor woman's notion of a fight between two girls, it may not be very easy to comprehend. The number of children out daily in the streets of London, employed in the various occupations I have named, together with others which may possibly have been overlooked, including those who beg without offering any article for sale, those who will work as light porters, as errand boys and the like, for chance passengers, has been variously calculated. Probably nothing like exactitude can be hoped for, much less expected, in such a speculation. For when a government census has been so frequently found to fail in correctness of detail, it appears highly improbable that the number of those so uncertain in their places of resort and so migratory in their habits can be ascertained with anything like a definite amount of certainty by a private individual. Taking the returns of accommodation afforded to these children in the casual wards of workhouses, refuges for the destitute and homeless poor, of the mendicity and other societies of a similar description, and those of our hospitals and jails, and these sources of information upon this subject can alone be confidently relied upon, and then taking into the calculation the additional numbers who pass the night in the variety of ways I have already enumerated, I think it will be found that the number of boys and girls selling in the streets of this city, and often dependent upon their own exertions for the commonest necessaries of life, may be estimated at some thousands, but nearer 10,000 than 20,000. The consideration which I have devoted to this branch of my subject has been considerable, but still not, in my own opinion, commensurate to the importance of its nature. Steps ought most unquestionably to be taken to palliate the evils and miseries I have pointed out, even if a positive remedy be indeed impossible. Each year sees an increase of the numbers of street children to a very considerable extent, and the exact nature of their position may be thus briefly depicted. What little information they receive is obtained from the worst class, from cheats, vagabonds, and rogues. What little amusement they indulge in springs from sources the most poisonous, the most fatal to happiness and welfare. What little they know of a home is necessarily associated with much that is vile and base. Their very means of existence, uncertain and precarious as it is to a great extent identified with petty chicanery, which is quickly communicated by one to the other, while their physical sufferings from cold, hunger, exposure to the weather, and other causes of a similar nature are constant, and at times extremely severe. Thus every means by which a proper intelligence may be conveyed to their minds is either closed or, at the least, tainted, while every duct by which a bad description of knowledge may be infused is sedulously cultivated and enlarged. Parental instruction, the comforts of a home, however humble, the great moral truths upon which society itself rests, the influence of proper example, the power of education, the effect of useful amusement, are all denied to them, or come to them so greatly vitiated that they rather tend to increase than to repress the very evils they were intended to remedy. The costers invariably say that no persons under the age of 15 should be allowed by law to vend articles in the streets. The reason they give for this is this, that the children under that period of life, having fewer wants and requiring less money to live than those who are older, will sell at a less profit than it is fair to expect the articles sold should yield, and thus they tersely conclude, "They prevents others living and ruins theirselves." There probably is truth in this remark, and I must confess that, for the sake of the children themselves, I should have no objection to see the suggestion acted upon, and yet there immediately rises the plain yet startling question, in such a case, what is to become of the children? I now cite the histories of street lads belonging to the several classes above specified, as illustrations of the truth of the statements advanced concerning the children street sellers generally. End of section 87. Section 89 of London Labour and the London Poor by Henry Mayhew, Volume 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, recording by Peter Yearsley. The Street Folk, Part 89. Of the capital and income of the street sellers of manufactured articles. Before giving a summary of the capital and income of the above-mentioned class, I shall endeavour to arrive at some notion as to the number of persons belonging to this division of the London street sellers. As far as I am able to ascertain, the following estimate may be taken as an approximation to the truth. There are in the metropolis 100 hardware sellers, 6 cheap johns, 30 sellers of cutlery, 6 sellers of tailors' needles, 20 sellers of metal spoons, 500 sellers of jewellery, 2 sellers of card counters, 15 sellers of medals, 6 sellers of rings and sovereigns for a wager, 25 sellers of children's gilt watches, 100 sellers of tinware, 100 swag barrowmen, 12 sellers of dog collars and so on, 40 sellers of tools, 380 sellers of crockery and glasswares, 12 sellers of spa ornaments, 30 sellers of china ornaments, 6 sellers of stone fruit, 120 packmen and duffers or hawkers of softwares, 500 sellers of tapes, cottons and so on, 100 sellers of lace, 15 sellers of japanned table covers, 500 brace and belt sellers, 50 sellers of hose, 3 sellers of waistcoats, 230 sellers of blacking, 125 sellers of black lead, 5 sellers of French polish, 7 sellers of grease removing composition, 4 sellers of plating balls, 8 sellers of corn salve, 4 sellers of china and glass cement, 6 sellers of razor paste, 55 sellers of crackers and detonating balls, 200 sellers of lucifer matches, 100 sellers of cigar lights, 30 sellers of gutta percha heads, 50 sellers of fly papers and beetle wafers, 25 sellers of poison for rats, 35 sellers of walking sticks, 30 sellers of whips, 4 sellers of clay and meerschaum pipes, 15 sellers of tobacco boxes, snuff boxes and cigar cases, 100 sellers of cigars, 50 sellers of sponge, 200 sellers of wash leathers, 35 sellers of spectacles and eyeglasses, 50 sellers of dolls, 50 lot sellers, 2 sellers of roulette tables, 4 sellers of rhubarb, 100 rat catchers, 50 sellers of combs, 50 sellers of money bags, 70 sellers of coat studs, making altogether a total of 4,272. Some few of the above trades are, however, of only a temporary character, as for instance, such as are engaged in the street sale of crackers and detonating balls, the month of November and the Christmas week being the only regular periods, with the exception of fairs and races, for the vending of those articles. The flypapers and beetle wafers are other instances of the same kind, summer being the only season in which there is a demand for such things. Making due allowance, therefore, for the temporary character of some of the callings, as well as for the itinerancy and unsettledness of other trades or traders, we may, I think, safely assume that the street sellers connected with this class are about 4,000 in number. Concerning the amount of capital invested in this branch of the street traffic, as well as the income derived therefrom, the following tables are given as being somewhat near the truth. Metal. Street sellers of hardware. Stock money for 100 vendors at 10 shillings each, £50, no shillings, no pence. Cheap Johns. 6 carts, £30 each, and stock money for the same, £50 each, £480, no shillings, no pence. Street sellers of cutlery. Stock money for 30 vendors at 1 shilling and sixpence each, £2, 5 shillings, no pence. Blind street sellers of tailors' needles. 6 boxes at 1 shilling and sixpence each, stock money for 6 vendors at 2 shillings each, £1, 1 shilling, no pence. Street sellers of metal spoons and so on at public houses. Stock money for 20 vendors at 2 shillings and sixpence each, £2, 10 shillings, no pence. Street sellers of jewellery. 500 boxes at 3 shillings and sixpence each, stock money for 500 vendors at 15 shillings each, £462, 10 shillings, no pence. Street sellers of card counters, medals and so on. 17 boxes at 3 shillings each, stock money for 17 vendors at 2 shillings and sixpence each, £4, 13 shillings and sixpence. Street sellers of rings and sovereigns for wagers. Stock money for 6 vendors at 2 shillings and sixpence each, 15 shillings, no pence. Street sellers of children's gilt watches. Stock money for 25 vendors at 5 shillings each, £6, 5 shillings, no pence. Street sellers of tinware. 50 stalls at 3 shillings each. Stock money for 100 vendors, averaging 6 shillings each, £37, 10 shillings, no pence. Street swag barrowmen. 100 barrows at £1 each, stock money for 150 swag barrowmen at 10 shillings each, £175, no shillings, no pence. Street sellers of dog collars, key rings, and so on. 6 stalls at 3 shillings each. Stock money for 12 vendors at 5 shillings each. £3, 18 shillings, no pence. Street sellers of tools. 6 stalls at 3 shillings each. Stock money for 40 vendors at 10 shillings each. £20, 18 shillings, no pence. Crockery and glass. Street sellers of crockery and glasswares. 100 barrows at £1 each. 280 baskets at 2 shillings and sixpence each. 280 linen bags at 1 shilling and sixpence each. Stock money for 380 vendors at 10 shillings each. £346, no shillings, no pence. Street sellers of spar and china ornaments and stone fruit. 16 barrows at £1 each. Stock money for 12 vendors of spar ornaments at 15 shillings each. 16 baskets at 2 shillings and sixpence each. 16 stalls at 3 shillings each. Stock money for 6 vendors of stone fruit at 10 shillings each, and 20 roulette tables at 2 shillings and sixpence each. Stock money for 30 sellers of china ornaments at 5 shillings each. £42, 8 shillings, no pence. Textile. Packmen and duffers or hawkers of soft wares. 120 wrappers at 2 shillings each. Stock money for 120 hawkers at £5 each. £612, no shillings, no pence. Street sellers of small ware or tapes, cottons, and so on. 500 boxes at 1 shilling and sixpence each. Stock money for 500 vendors at 1 shilling each. £62, 10 shillings, no pence. Street sellers of lace. 20 baskets at 2 shillings and sixpence each. 20 boxes at 3 shillings each. 60 stalls at 3 shillings each. Stock money for 100 vendors, averaging 2 shillings and sixpence each. £27, no shillings, no pence. Street sellers of Japan table covers. Stock money for 15 sellers at 10 shillings each. £7, 10 shillings, no pence. Street sellers of braces and belts, hose, trouser straps, and waistcoats. 100 stalls at 4 shillings each. 300 rods with hooks to hang the braces upon at 3d each. Stock money for 500 brace sellers at 5 shillings each. £148, 15 shillings, no pence. Street sellers of hose. Stock money for 50 vendors at 10 shillings each. £25, no shillings, no pence. Street sellers of waistcoats. Stock money for 3 vendors at 15 shillings each. £2, 5 shillings, no pence. Chemicals. Street sellers of blacking. 200 boxes at 6pence each. 30 bags at 1 shilling each. Stock money for 230 vendors, averaging 2 shillings each. £29, 10 shillings, no pence. Street sellers of black lead. Stock money for 125 vendors at 1 shilling each. £6, 5 shillings, no pence. Street sellers of French polish. 5 boxes at 1 shilling and sixpence each. Stock money for 5 vendors at 2 shillings and sixpence each. £1, no shillings, no pence. Street sellers of grease removing composition. 7 boxes at 1 shilling and sixpence each. Stock money for 7 vendors at 1 shilling and sixpence each. £1, 1 shilling, no pence. Street sellers of plating balls. 4 boxes at 1 shilling and sixpence each. Stock money for 4 vendors at 1 shilling each. 10 shillings, no pence. Street sellers of corn salve. 8 boxes at 1 shilling and sixpence each. Stock money for 8 vendors at 6pence each. 16 shillings, no pence. Street sellers of glass and china cement. 4 boxes at 1 shilling and sixpence each. Stock money for 4 vendors at 6pence each. 8 shillings, no pence. Street sellers of razor paste. 6 trays at 2 shillings each. Stock money for 6 vendors at 1 shilling each. 18 shillings, no pence. Street sellers of crackers and detonating balls. 55 trays at 2 shillings each. Stock money for 55 vendors at 1 shilling and sixpence each. £9, 12 shillings and sixpence. Street sellers of lucifer matches. 200 boxes at 6pence each. Stock money for 200 vendors at 6pence each. £10, no shillings, no pence. Street sellers of cigar lights. Stock money for 100 vendors at 6pence each. £2, 10 shillings, no pence. Street sellers of gutta percha heads. 30 boxes at 1 shilling and sixpence each. Stock money for 30 vendors at 1 shilling each. £3 15 shillings no pence. Street sellers of fly papers and beetle wafers. Stock money for 50 vendors at 1 shilling each. £2 10 shillings no pence. Street sellers of poison for rats. Stock money for 25 vendors at 2 shillings and sixpence each. £3 2 shillings and sixpence. Miscellaneous. Street sellers of walking sticks. Stock money for 35 vendors at 5 shillings each. £8 15 shillings no pence. Street sellers of whips. Stock money for 30 vendors at 15 shillings each. £22 10 shillings no pence. Street sellers of pipes. Tobacco. Stock money for 4 vendors at 5 shillings each. £1 no shillings no pence. Street sellers of snuff boxes, tobacco boxes, and so on. 15 stalls at 4 shillings each. Stock money for 15 vendors at 10 shillings each. £10 10 shillings no pence. Street sellers of cigars. Stock money for 100 vendors at 10 shillings each. £50 no shillings no pence. Street sellers of sponge. 50 baskets at 1 shilling each. Stock money for 50 vendors at 5 shillings each. £15 no shillings no pence. Street sellers of wash leathers. Stock money for 200 vendors at 2 shillings and sixpence each. £25 no shillings no pence. Street sellers of spectacles and eyeglasses. Stock money for 35 vendors at 5 shillings each. £8 15 shillings no pence. Street sellers of dolls. 20 stalls at 4 shillings each. 30 baskets at 3 shillings and sixpence each. Stock money for 50 vendors at 10 shillings each. £34 5 shillings no pence. Street lot sellers. 50 boxes at 1 shilling and sixpence each. Stock money for 50 sellers at 2 shillings and sixpence each. £10 no shillings no pence. Street sellers of roulette boxes. 2 baskets at 3 shillings and sixpence. Stock money for 2 vendors at £1 each. £2 7 shillings no pence. Street sellers of rhubarb and spice. 4 boxes at 6 shillings each. Stock money for 4 vendors at 10 shillings each. £3 4 shillings no pence. Rat catchers. 20 belts at 3 shillings and sixpence each. 25 cages at 1 shilling each. 25 pair of ferrets at 2 shillings and sixpence per pair. Keep for 25 pair of ferrets at 4p per pair weekly. £8 5 shillings and 10p. Street sellers of combs. 50 stalls at 3 shillings each. 50 boxes at 3 shillings and sixpence each. Stock money for 50 vendors at 2 shillings and sixpence each. £22 10 shillings no pence. Street sellers of money bags. Stock money for 50 vendors at 2 shillings each. £5 no shillings no pence. Street sellers of coat studs. 70 boxes at 1 shilling and sixpence each. Stock money for 70 vendors at 2 shillings and sixpence each. £14 no shillings no pence. Total amount of capital £2,833 13 shillings and 4p. Income of the street sellers of manufactured articles. Metal. Street sellers of hardware. There are at present 100 hardware sellers trading in London and so on. Half of them, I am assured, may be said to take on an average from 20 shillings to 25 shillings weekly the year through. A quarter take 15 shillings, and the remaining quarter from 7 shillings and sixpence to 10 shillings. Calculating an average receipt of 15 shillings each per week throughout the entire class, men, women and children, we find there is annually expended in street sold hardwares £3,900 no shillings no pence. Cheap Johns. If we calculate that there are 6 Cheap Johns in London throughout the year, and that they each take £4 per day for 9 months in the year, or £24 per week, this amounts to about £5,000 in 9 months. Say that during the winter, or the remaining 13 weeks of the year, their receipts are £15 each per week. This amounts to upwards of £1,000 additional, thus making a gross annual outlay with these dealers of £6,000 no shillings no pence. Street sellers of cutlery. Reckoning there are 30 men who are engaged regularly in the sale of cutlery, and that the average takings of each are about 15 shillings weekly. This gives a yearly expenditure in the street trade of cutlery £1,170, no shillings, no pence. Blind street sellers of tailors' needles. There are now 6 men engaged in selling needles at the several tailors' shops, and calculating their average daily receipts to be 2 shillings and sixpence, or 15 shillings a week each, we find that the annual takings of the whole are £234, no shillings, no pence. Street sellers of metal spoons in public houses. From the best information I can arrive at, the number of metal spoon hawkers is 20, each of whom take upon an average 16 shillings weekly, thus showing a yearly expenditure in the street sale of spoons of £832, no shillings, no pence. Street sellers of jewellery. I am informed that there are at present 500 persons engaged in the street sale of jewellery, and calculating a weekly profit of 10 shillings and sixpence and a receipt of 18 shillings per individual, we find expended in the street trade £23,400. Street sellers of card counters. If there be on the year's average only 2 street sellers disposing of jacks and earning 9 shillings a week, to earn which the receipts will be about 20 shillings, we find expended in the streets on these trifles annually £104, no shillings, no pence. Street sellers of medals. An intelligent man familiar with the trade, and who was in the habit of clubbing his stock money with 2 others, so that they might buy a gross of medals at a time, calculated that 15 medal sellers were engaged in the traffic the year through, and earned upon medals alone 6pence a day each, to clear which they must take 6 shillings and sixpence weekly, giving a yearly outlay of £253, 10 shillings, no pence. Street sellers of rings and sovereigns for a wager. One of this class, who is up to all the dodges of the trade, informed me that there were only 6 men working the rings and sovereigns now in the streets, and that the average takings of each might be about 12 shillings weekly, thus showing a yearly expenditure of £187, 4 shillings, no pence. Street sellers of children's gilt watches. Calculating that 25 persons now vend watches for 12 weeks in the year, and that each clears 8 shillings weekly, taking 24 shillings, we find yearly expended in London streets on these toy watches £360, no shillings, no pence. Street sellers of tinware. If we calculate an average receipt per individual of 10 shillings weekly, we find, reckoning 100 sellers, a yearly expenditure on tins bought in the streets of £2,600, no shillings, no pence. Swag barrowmen. Calculating that 100 of these traders are the year round in London, note some are absent all the summer at country fairs and on any favourable opportunity, end note, and that each takes £2 weekly, we find thus expended in the streets of London in a year no less than £10,400, no shillings, no pence. Sellers of dog collars, key rings, and so on. Reckoning 12 shillings weekly taken by 12 men, there is expended yearly in the streets upon dog collars £374, no shillings, no pence. Street sellers of tools. There are at present 40 men engaged in selling tools throughout the metropolis, and they each average about 15 shillings weekly. This gives a yearly outlay of £1,560, no shillings, no pence. Street sellers of crockery and glasswares. According to the best calculation, there are 380 vendors of crockery and glasswares, and the average takings of each may be said to amount to 10 shillings weekly, so giving an annual expenditure in the streets of £9,880, no shillings, no pence. Street sellers of spa ornaments. In this trade I am informed that there are now 12 men, 9 of whom are assisted by their wives, and that in the summer months there are 18. Their profits are about 15 shillings per week on an average of the whole year. What amount of money may be expended by the public in the street purchase of spas, I am unable definitely to state, so much being done in the way of barter. But assuming that there are 14 sellers throughout the year, and that their profits are cent per cent, there would appear to be laid out in the streets every year on these articles about £1,000, no shillings, no pence. Street sellers of china ornaments. There are, I am informed, about 30 persons in this trade. If we calculate the receipts at 10 shillings weekly, a low average considering the success of some of the raffles, we find yearly expended in the streets in these ornamental productions £780, no shillings, no pence. Street sellers of stone fruit. Supposing that there are 6 persons selling stone fruit in the streets throughout the year, and that each earns 9 shillings weekly, one man said 7 shillings and sixpence was the limit of his weekly profits, we find £140 received as profit on these articles, and calculating the gains at 33%, an outlay of £420, no shillings, no pence. Textile. Packmen and duffers, or hawkers of soft wares. I am told by a London hawker of soft goods that the number of his craft, hawking London and its vicinity, as far as he can judge, is about 120. In this number are included the Irish linen hawkers. I am also informed that the fair traders' profits amount to about 20%, while those of the not over-particular trader range from 80 to 200%. In a fair way of business, it is said the hawker's takings will amount, upon an average, to £7 or £8 per week, whereas the receipts of the duffer, or unfair hawker, will sometimes reach to £50 per week. At £7 per week each, the gross takings will amount to £43,680, no shillings, no pence. Street sellers of small ware, or tapes, cottons, laces, and so on. From the best data at my command, I believe there are not fewer than 500 individuals selling these wares in London. Their weekly receipts do not appear to average more than 6 shillings each. Hence the expenditure on these articles will amount to £7,800, no shillings, no pence. Street sellers of lace. 100 persons in this trade may be said each to take 10 shillings and sixpence weekly, the profit being about cent per cent. Hence the annual sum expended in the streets in lace and similar commodities is £2,730, no shillings, no pence. Street sellers of japanned table covers. Calculating that 15 street sellers each take 25 shillings weekly the year round, one half being the profit, including their advantages in bartering and raffling, we find there is expended yearly upon japanned table covers bought in the streets £975, no shillings, no pence. Street sellers of braces and belts. 500 brace sellers are said to clear 5 shillings a week each on those articles alone, and estimating the profit at 33%, it shows a street expenditure of £26,196, and calculating 1/8 less for belts, we find that the annual outlay in the streets on braces and belts is £29,470, no shillings, no pence. Street sellers of hose. A few pairs of women's stockings are hawked by women and sold to servant maids, but the trade in these goods, I am informed, including all classes of sellers, of whom there may be 50, does not exceed, notwithstanding the universality of the ware, the receipt of 6 shillings weekly per individual, with a profit of from 1 shilling and 4pence to 2 shillings. Thus there is an aggregate expenditure yearly of £800, no shillings, no pence. Street sellers of waistcoats. There are sometimes no waistcoat sellers at all, but generally 2 and not unfrequently 3. The profits of these men are 1 shilling on a bad and 2 shillings and sixpence on a good day. As at intervals the street sellers dispose of a sleeve waistcoat, note, waistcoat with sleeves, end note, at from 4 shillings and sixpence to 6 shillings, we may estimate the average earnings in the trade at 5 shillings per market day, or 10 shillings in the week. Assuming their profits to be 33%, this shows an annual outlay of £312, no shillings, no pence. Chemical. Street sellers of blacking. There are at present 230 vendors of blacking in the London streets. 210 of these sell cake and liquid blacking, each taking 6 shillings weekly, while the 20 others work the Mews with a superior kind of blacking, taking 15 shillings each. Thus there is a yearly expenditure in the sale of blacking in the streets of £4,056, no shillings, no pence. Street sellers of black lead. There are, I am informed, 100 to 150 persons selling and hawking black lead in the streets. It may be estimated that they take 4 shillings each weekly, the adults selling other small articles with the black lead. Thus we find, averaging the number of sellers at 125, that there is expended yearly in the street sale of this article £1,300, no shillings, no pence. Street sellers of French polish. The French polish sellers, I am assured by a man familiar with the business, take 2 shillings a day each. The 2 shillings leaves a profit of 10pence. The street expenditure is therefore, reckoning 5 regular sellers annually, £156, no shillings, no pence. Street sellers of grease removing composition. Calculating that 7 grease removers carry on the sale of the article 3 days each week, and clear 1 shilling and 6pence per day, we find a yearly expenditure on this commodity equal to £81, 18 shillings, no pence. Street sellers of plating balls. Reckoning that 4 men are engaged in selling plating balls 3 days in each week, and that each takes 2 shillings a day, we find that there is an annual outlay on the sale of this article of £62, 8 shillings, no pence. Street sellers of corn salve. Calculating that 8 of these traders take 10 shillings weekly, we find there is expended in the streets on this salve £208, no shillings, no pence. Street sellers of glass and china cement. There are at present 4 men vending this article in the streets of London, and if each seller takes 5 shillings weekly, of which 4 shillings may be profit, we find there is expended yearly by street customers in this cement £52, no shillings, no pence. Street sellers of razor paste. Calculating that 6 men work the metropolis daily, taking 2 shillings each per day, with 1 shilling and 2pence profit, we find the amount of the street outlay to be upwards of £187, no shillings, no pence. Street sellers of crackers and detonating balls. I am assured that for a few days last November, from 50 to 60 men and women were selling crackers in the streets. The most intelligent man that I met with, acquainted, as he called it, with all the ins and outs of the trade, calculated that during the month of November and at Christmas, £100 at least was expended in the streets in these combustibles, and another £100 at other times of the year, thus giving altogether a yearly outlay of £200, no shillings, no pence. Street sellers of lucifer matches. Supposing that each of the 200 traders take, on lucifers alone, but 4 shillings weekly, selling 9 dozen, with a profit to the seller of from 1 shilling and 9pence to 2 shillings and 6pence, we find on lucifer matches bought in the streets an annual outlay of £2,080, no shillings, no pence. Street sellers of cigar lights or fusees. It will, I believe, be accurate to state that in the streets there are generally 100 persons subsisting or endeavouring to subsist on the sale of fusees alone. It may be estimated also that each of these traders averages a receipt of 10pence a day, with a profit exceeding 6pence, so that the sum yearly laid out in the streets in this way amounts to £1,300, no shillings, no pence. Street sellers of gutta percha heads and so on. There are at present, I am informed, 30 persons selling gutta percha heads in the streets, some of them confining their business solely to those articles. Their average receipts, I am assured, do not exceed 5 shillings a week each, for though some may take 15 shillings a week, others, and generally the stationary head sellers, do not take 1 shilling. The profit to the street retailer is 1/3 of his receipts. From this calculation it appears that if the present rate of sale continue, the sum spent yearly in these street toys is £390, no shillings, no pence. Street sellers of fly papers and beetle wafers. Last summer, I was informed, there were 50 or 60 persons selling fly papers and beetle wafers in the streets. Some of them boys, and all of them of the general class of street sellers who take to any trade for which 1 shilling suffices as capital. Their average earnings may be estimated at 2 shillings and 6pence a day, about 1/2 being profit. This gives a street outlay for a season of 10 weeks of £375, no shillings, no pence. Street sellers of poison for rats. Calculating 25 sellers of rat poison, and each taking on an average 1 shilling daily for the sale of their article, we find that the sum annually expended upon this commodity amounts to £390, no shillings, no pence. Miscellaneous. Street sellers of walking sticks. For 12 weeks of the year there are, I am told, every day 35 stick sellers, each taking on an average 30 shillings a week, with a profit individually of about 12 shillings. We find thus that the sum expended yearly in walking sticks in the streets is £630, no shillings, no pence. Street sellers of whips and so on, averaging that 30 whip sellers take 25 shillings each weekly, with profits of from 5 shillings to 10 shillings. In London alone, we find that the yearly sum expended in the streets in whips amounts to £1,950, no shillings, no pence. Street sellers of pipes, tobacco. If we calculate that 4 persons sell pipes daily the year through, taking each 25 shillings and clearing 10 shillings, we find the yearly sum expended upon the hawkers' pipes amounts to £260, no shillings, no pence. Street sellers of snuff boxes, tobacco boxes, and so on. Reckoning that 15 persons trading on snuff and tobacco and cigar boxes take 18 shillings weekly, clearing 7 shillings or 8 shillings, we find the sum thus expended annually amounts to £702, no shillings, no pence. Street sellers of cigars. Reckoning the number of vendors of cigars at 100, and the average takings of each to be 20 shillings weekly, we have a yearly outlay of £5,200, no shillings, no pence. Street sellers of sponge. Calculating then that only 50 persons, and so allowing for irregularities in the trade, vend sponge daily, and that each takes 15 shillings weekly, some taking 25 shillings and others but 5 shillings, with about half profit on the whole, the common sponge is often from 200 to 300% profit. We find the outlay to be £1,950, no shillings, no pence. Street sellers of wash leather. There are, I am assured, 100 individuals selling little or nothing else but wash leather in London, for these traders are found in all the suburbs, and that they respectively take 10 shillings weekly, with a profit of from 4 shillings to 5 shillings. There are also 100 other persons selling them occasionally, along with other goods, and as they vend the higher priced articles, they probably receive nearly an equal amount. Hence it would appear that there is annually expended in the streets in this purchase upwards of £5,000, no shillings, no pence. Street sellers of spectacles and eyeglasses. It may be estimated, I am assured, that there are 35 men who vend these articles daily, taking 15 shillings a week, with a profit of 10 shillings, the yearly expenditure being thus £1,365, no shillings, no pence. Street sellers of dolls. There are at least, at this time of year, when the fairs are coming on, 50 doll hawkers who vend nothing else. Say that each of these sell 1 dozen dolls per day, and that their average price is 4pence each. That is just £10 a day and £60 per week. In the winter time so many are not sold, but I have no doubt that £50 worth of dolls are sold each week throughout the year by London hawkers alone. Hence the annual outlay on street dolls would be close upon £3,000, no shillings, no pence. Street lot sellers. It may be estimated that 50 men carry on this trade. Each of these may take 13 shillings weekly, with a profit of 7 shillings and sixpence, so showing the annual street outlay to be £1,690, no shillings, no pence. Street sellers of roulette tables. Calculating the 2 sellers of roulette tables take 30 shillings each weekly, we find the annual outlay amounts to £156, no shillings, no pence. Street sellers of rhubarb. Reckoning 4 street sellers of rhubarb and spice, each taking 18 shillings weekly, we find the sum annually spent in the sale of these articles to be upwards of £187, no shillings, no pence. Rat catchers. There are, I am told, 100 rat catchers resorting at intervals to London, but only a fourth of that number can be estimated as carrying on their labours regularly in town. Their average earnings, I am assured, do not exceed 15 shillings a week. Thus there is a yearly expenditure of £975, no shillings, no pence. Street sellers of combs. From the best information I have gained, there are 50 persons who sell nothing but combs. The average takings of each are 9 shillings a week, showing the yearly outlay in the streets on these articles to be £1,170, no shillings, no pence. Street sellers of money bags. There are at present 50 persons, consisting of men, women and children, vending money bags in the streets of London, each taking on an average 1 shilling and sixpence daily, or 9 shillings per week, and so giving a yearly expenditure of £1,170, no shillings, no pence. Street sellers of coat studs. There are, I am informed, no less than 70 persons, consisting of men, women and children. These, I am told, take upon an average 15 shillings a week each, their usual profits being cent per cent. Thus we find a yearly outlay on studs bought in the streets of £2,730, no shillings, no pence. Total amount of income £188,189, no shillings, no pence. The end of section 89, and the end of volume 1 of London Labour and the London Poor by Henry Mayhew.